Hello everyone. 1 Kings chapter 18. Jesus said on a number of occasions things like, "You're either for me or against me," or "You can't serve both God and money," indicating that we needed to make a choice, choosing whom we would serve. And that's the challenge, isn't it? Those of us who are Christians, who follow Jesus, we know that our hearts are drawn, they're torn to different things. Torn between the biblical God and other things that pretend to be God. Things like money, things like power, sex, relationships, status, people's approval, sport, career, travel, the list goes on and on. All good things in and of themselves, but taken out of their proper context and overvalued, especially when they replace the Creator, they become gods. Idols, things that we worship instead of God. And today we get a loving warning to wake up and choose the true God and serve wholeheartedly the true and living God rather than these false gods that don't save, that don't deliver, that don't satisfy in the end. That is unless, of course, the biblical God is not the true God, and one of those other things maybe are God. Well, if that's true, then we should serve them, I suppose. And I'm not just thinking of functional gods like sex, money, power. What about religious gods, other worldviews that purport to have deities that rule their world and offer them salvation under different terms? What if they're true? What if the Hindus have it right, for example? Well, a bit of context. Israel has been willingly led into wholesale idolatry by King Ahab and his idolatrous wife, Jezebel, who's a bit of a priestess of the Baal cult. You can read about that in the end of chapter 16. And Israel knew what would happen. They'd read their Bibles, they knew about God's arrangement, God's relationship arrangement, which we call the covenant, from places like Deuteronomy 28, where it says that if they abandon God in this way and turn to other idols, he would send them things like plagues and droughts as a wake-up call, as a wake-up judgment. And so a drought is announced in chapter 17. We saw that last week. And now, come chapter 18, it's about 3.5 years later. Have they learnt their lesson about the evil and folly of turning from God to idols? Or will they continue to serve Baal? Now, you've got to try to empathise at some level. You see, Baal was a nature god, the storm god actually, the god who sent the rains to bless the crops and help the agricultural cycle boom. And following Baal had its positives, it had its attractions. It was associated with prosperity, so agricultural prosperity. It was associated with power, right? Social power, status. If you're in the right club, you get that recognition that you wanted. And pleasure. Sex was highly involved. It was part of the fertility cult. So fortune, fame and flesh on offer and frequently delivered. Yeah, there were reasons to follow Baal. Just as there are reasons, we think, to follow other things and put other things first in our life. So Israel have received 3 years of drought. They've received 3 years of disciplinary judgment from the Lord to wake them up. And now, to add to that wake-up call, God is about to make whom they should serve unmistakably clear. So let's jump in at chapter 18, verse 1. The setting. A long time after, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I'll send rain on the land." So Elijah goes and presents himself to Ahab. So the drought was announced in chapter 17, verse 1, and here he's going to announce the end of the drought in this chapter. Now, meanwhile, back at Ahab's palace, we're introduced to a bloke called Obadiah, which is kind of a cool name. I missed out anyway. I'm going to sum up this section. It's from verse 2 to 25. I'll do a quick little summary of it. Obadiah is a good guy. He happens to be King Ahab's palace administrator. So he's one of the top dogs in Ahab's cabinet. And because the famine is really severe, the king and Obadiah set out to search for some water holes and some green grass so that they can feed their cattle so their cattle don't die. And they split up to search for this, and as Obadiah is walking along, he runs into Elijah. In 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 8, we get a description of Elijah's appearance, and I love how the New American Standard Bible puts it. He was a hairy man with a leather girdle bound around his loins. That's great. He was a hairy guy, you can see how I relate, with a leather belt around his waist. A little bit like John the Baptist, actually. Elijah says, hey Obadiah, go and tell Ahab that I want to see him. But Obadiah doesn't like that idea of going to tell Ahab to come and meet Elijah, because Obadiah knows that Elijah has the habit of disappearing. He just gets whisked off on another mission. And Ahab really wants to see Elijah. Ahab really wants to get his hands on Elijah. So if Obadiah says, hey Ahab, come and meet Elijah, and Elijah's not there, then Ahab's going to get really angry and kill Obadiah. But Elijah says, no, I'm not going to do a disappearing trick. I'm going to do what the Lord wants me to do, according to verse 1, and meet with Ahab. So he reassures him, and Obadiah, in verse 16, grabs Ahab, and Ahab went to Elijah. When he sees Elijah, when the king sees Elijah, he says to him, is that you troubler of Israel? He accuses him of causing trouble to the whole nation, because he has been upsetting the status quo, hasn't he? He's been pointing out their sin and announcing judgment. But hang on a minute. Who is the real troubler here? Who is the real problem here? In verse 18 says, I'm not, you are. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and followed the Baals. Ahab's the real problem here. He's been troubling his father just like his father before him, Omri. He's led Israel to reject God and serve these fertility gods. He's persecuted the prophets. He's incited this drought and famine. And then Elijah says, okay, look, we're going to settle this once and for all. Bring all the prophets of Baal and meet me at Mount Carmel. It's time to sort it out. So in verse 20 through 40, we get this scene at Mount Carmel. Everyone gathers around the mountain for a big showdown. Verse 21, Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. Elijah accuses them of wavering between two gods, between two options, between two opinions. Maybe they've got FOMO or something, spiritual FOMO. And their response confirms it. Verse 21, they say nothing. The people said nothing. They can't decide either way. They're wavering, right? They're sitting on the fence. They got one foot on the pier and the other foot on the boat, and it's slowly drifting apart. You've got to choose. Choose one. But which one? Well, it's time to make it obvious which one. So in verse 23, the terms of the contest are set that are place one bull each on their respective wood piles, but not set a match to it. Then they are to call on their respective gods, and the God who answers by fire wins. The God who answers by fire is the true God they should serve. And when they hear this, the people say, yeah, that sounds good. Verse 24. The challenge seems fair and reasonable. They might not be sure which God to serve, but they think this is a good way to find out. So the prophets of Baal get to go first. In verse 25, they build the wood pile and they place their bull on it. And then in verse 26, they start calling upon the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shout. But there was no response. No one answered. Just crickets. Nothing. So they add dancing to their repertoire. They danced around the altar they've made. And by midday, so we're talking like maybe they've been going for 4 to 6 hours here, Baal is still not responding, and so Elijah takes the opportunity to start mocking them. At verse 27, at noon Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's in deep thought, or busy, or travelling, or maybe he's taking a nap and needs to be woken up. Where is this Baal? Perhaps he's meditating deeply and he can't be distracted. Or perhaps he's busy. You know, the literal rendering of the Hebrew is he's going to the toilet. Our translators are too polite. Perhaps he's on the bog. Perhaps he's taken a dump. That's what Elijah's saying. Or maybe he's on a long journey somewhere else. Or maybe he's having a power snooze. And this mocking kind of works. It gets under their skin and makes them more determined. Excuse me. Woo. And they ramp up their efforts in verse 28. They shout louder. They slash themselves with swords. And midday passed. They continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice. They resort to this elaborate, frenzied, blood-soaked, crazed, attention-grabbing technique. Surely this will prompt the attention of Baal. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention, we're told. It's a devastating silence. And you see, the problem is not that Baal is distracted or on the toilet or napping. The problem is he does not exist. You got to wonder, don't you? How much religion, even fervently expressed religion, is worshipping a figment of our imagination. Well, it's Elijah's turn next. Verse 30 through 38, he prepares the altar in a way that remembers God's covenant promise. In verse 31, he sets up 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And he recalls God's promises to them. The promise to bless them and increase them in number and give them a land in which to enjoy a relationship with him. If only they would reject Baal and return to him. Then he arranges the wood and he places the bull on top of it, verse 33, and then he gets them to saturate all of it 3 times with lots of water. And then, when it's ready, Elijah steps forward and prays. Now, compared to the elaborate and lengthy display of the Baal prophets, Elijah's prayer is quite short and simple. Verse 36, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. He prays for God to reveal himself so that everyone knows that he is God, not Baal, and that Elijah is his servant, and that he's making way for relationship. He's calling them back into relationship. You can imagine there was probably a moment of great nervousness, maybe even for Elijah. Everyone holds their breath. And then an astonishing and unmistakable moment of revelation takes place. Verse 38, the fire of the Lord fell. This great torrent of fire falls from the heavens and burns up everything. You can imagine the sight and the sound. The sacrifice is gone, the wood's gone, the stones are gone, the water's gone. How do the people respond? Well, what are you going to do when you see that? Verse 39, when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate face down. And they cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. They are convinced, at least temporarily. How could they deny such an obvious statement that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the real Lord? You see, what we see here is not that the battle was between Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal. The battle was actually between Baal and Israel's God. Yahweh is the clear and decisive winner, and the people acknowledge him as God in a moment of repentance. And there's something I hadn't noticed before, that this whole scene here is actually a strong allusion to Leviticus 19, where a bull is placed on the altar and the fire of God burns it up, and then all the people fall down. It's a great parallel, and what's being said here is that this is an atonement scene. God is not just revealing himself powerfully, but acting to restore relationship through atonement. He's calling them back into relationship with himself. He's turning their hearts back to him, verse 37, and making forgiveness available. He's revealing himself in order to rescue and restore them for relationship. But for those who refuse to acknowledge him and continue in their idolatry, verse 40, Elijah commands the prophets of Baal to be killed. There is only judgment for those who still align with the false gods. So we get revelation and recognition and rescue, but also judgment here. And then at the end of the chapter, in verse 41 to the end, the drought breaks. Right? It seems as though Israel have learned their lesson and returned to the Lord. They've acknowledged that he's the God that they should serve. How long this repentance lasts for is another question. But for the moment, the covenant relationship is repaired and the curse of drought is lifted and the rain begins to fall as Elijah prays for it in verse 42 onwards. So what's the big idea? What's the main idea that comes out of this passage? Well, in 1 Kings 18, God clearly calls his people back to himself. And he does it through a powerful display of revelation, the provision of atonement, and the reversal of the covenant curse. God's the one who controls the rain, not Baal. And this shows that God indeed is the one worth serving and worshipping, not Baal. Therefore, they don't need to waver. And neither do we. What's the big idea for us? Well, we're torn, aren't we, between the true and living God and the idols of our heart and the idols of our culture and the other gods worshipped in this world. So who will you serve? Who do you serve? The thing is automatically your God, whatever that thing is, if you serve it as the most important thing, as your highest value, your highest priority. But why serve that thing if it's not actually God? What can it actually do for you in the end? There's the functional gods we have. Baal promised prosperity and good luck and sexual pleasure, fame, fortune and flesh. And we're lured into the worship and service of these sorts of things. We're promised the good life by money and sex and power and family and academia and recognition. All these things promise us something and we think we need. And so we serve at their altar. We sacrifice our time and our life and our effort and our money to gain these things. But apart from the deep offense of rejecting God and replacing him with these things, the truth is that we weren't designed to be mastered by or ruled by these things. They just end up ruining us. They don't deliver what they promise. They corrode our humanity and ultimately fail us. You can do a thought experiment. You'll work it out. For example, on money and greed. Right? What are the negative effects? You work this out. Sit down and think about it. What are the negative effects of putting money as your highest priority? Just ask that of every other functional idol. What are the negative effects of putting my body as the highest priority? Or sex, or career, or status, or academia, or family, or possessions, or what is it? You can work it out. There's only one who truly knows how to fulfill our human potential. There's only one who is actually God. The one who can deliver us from what we really need delivering from. The one who is totally worthy of our service and attention and worship. The one who reveals himself to forgive and restore forever. But wait a minute, I hear you asking. How do we know he is truly God as opposed to the other idols? How do we know the God of the Bible is the true God, to put it bluntly? What about other religious deities? As I said before, what if the Hindu deities are true and we've made a big mistake about, the biblical God? It's actually a great question, and I just want to give you a very brief, excuse me, I'm struggling today, a brief answer that I often work through. Firstly, all religious claims cannot be equally true because they contradict each other. You need to go away and think about this. You see, God cannot both exist and not exist at the same time and in the same place. If he doesn't exist, then he does not. If he doesn't exist, then he can't exist, right? Or if he does exist, then you can't say he doesn't exist. If there's one God, then there's not many gods. If there's many gods, then there's not one gods. Did Jesus die on the cross? Some say yes. Did he die on the cross? Islam will say no. Well, they can't both be true. Lots of religious claims contradict each other. They can't all be true. Therefore, point 2, either no religious claim is true because they all cancel each other's out, in which case the atheists win. There is no God, or at least no God who's revealed himself, herself. So either no religious claim is true, or only one religion could be true. If there was substantial evidence to show that one was true, then by the process of logic and the law of non-contradiction, none of the other ones could be true. So if we could show that, Allah was the true God, then Hinduism's wrong. Because there's only one God, not many gods. Right? So here's the crucial question for every religion. What is the quality and quantity of evidence for each religious claim? And really, at the heart of it is this. What is the quality and quantity of revelation? That's what we need. We need evidence of revelation. All right? What's the quality and quantity of revelation for each new religion? Now, we don't have time to go into all the evidence for Christianity. But much of it is based on faithful eyewitness reporting that has come down to us through the New Testament documents. Christianity is uniquely testable at this point. All other religions began with someone's personal or private idea or experience. Very hard to prove or disprove. Christianity began in public, as a publicly witnessed event. It's open, therefore, to historical testing and verification or falsification. And when we add up all the evidence for Christianity, we can say the following, and this is where I'll finish my talk. God has revealed himself decisively in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And he's turned up to rescue us back to relationship with himself. We call it the incarnation, right? In Jesus' incarnation, God became flesh and dwelt among us and walked among us. He's revealing himself in the person of Jesus. Historically, people saw God walking around in the person of Jesus. Secondly, in Jesus' death, he atones for our rebellion and our idolatry, making forgiveness and reconciliation possible. Now, what God is that kind? What God is that committed to your good to that extent that he would lay down his life to bring you back? It's astonishing. And thirdly, in Jesus' resurrection, he is publicly witnessed and worshipped as Lord by many people in different places. You see, in 1 Kings 18, the true God worth serving was the one who revealed himself and offered rescue back into relationship. And just as in 1 Kings 18, the moment of revelation and rescue comes in the person of Jesus. Jesus is the revelation of God to rescue us back for relationship through atonement. So, serve him. If he's God, serve him. The urgent and best thing we can do is to stop ignoring or to stop wavering between options and spiritual FOMO and to turn our hearts back to him and live for him as our highest priority. Elijah was right in verse 21. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if something else is God, follow that. Who will you follow?